Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the JCC's first book and author conversation of the season with Daniel Sokatch and moderator Jonathan Fass. I'm Connie Cirillo-Freeman, Director of Arts and Culture and Seniors. We're so pleased to welcome Daniel Sokatch in conversation about his book, And We Talk About Israel, a guide for the curious, confused, and conflicted. It promises to be a challenging and certainly a thought-provoking talk. I want to acknowledge and thank our Book and Author Committee for providing their invaluable support to our arts and culture programming. Our staff also deserves kudos for handling everything that needs to be done in these a little bit difficult times. We will be recording this program, so we ask you to please put yourself on mute, and we'll entertain questions from the audience, so please put your questions into the chat and we will address them, as many as we can. There also is a book sale, which I will give you some information about later on. So I am now very pleased to introduce our moderator, Jonathan Fass. A Stanford resident and JCC member, Jonathan has spent his career in Jewish education, both in the United States and Israel. He's currently the Managing Director of Educational Technology and Strategy for the Jewish Education Project, an organization that supports Jewish educators around the world. He also leads Jewish learning opportunities for the Stanford community, the Stanford JCC, and the United Jewish Federation of Greater Stanford, New Canaan, and Darien. And now, Jonathan.
Thank you so much, Connie. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm so delighted to have the opportunity to spend the evening with you and with our Stanford community, and of course with our author, Daniel Sokatch. Daniel, welcome to our community, even virtually.
Thank you.
Delighted that you can be with us tonight. And I want to tell you, and all of us in the Zoom audience today, that Daniel and I go actually way back, almost 20 years, when I was a new professional at the Jewish Community Center in Los Angeles at the West Side JCC. I had an office, and down the hall was a guy named Daniel who had just founded the Progressive Jewish Alliance. And 20 years later, we're meeting again to have a conversation about your book, which was absolutely a pleasure to read. And I thought perhaps before we jump into the book itself, you could just tell me a little bit about what I've missed in your life for the last 20 years so that we can catch up and learn a little bit more about you.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. And it's great to see you again after all these years. And thank you, Connie and Nancy, and all of you in this community. Connie, you said this was the start of your book series. Well, that's a nice serendipity because you are the start of my mostly virtual, but not totally virtual author tour for this book. And there are scores and scores of events happening between now and the spring, and I've pre-recorded a few of them, but you are the first live book event that I'm doing. So it's an honor to be here. And as I revealed to our hosts just before we began, I am a Connecticut native. So it's also sort of nice. I was born at Yale New Haven Hospital and grew up to age 11 in Cheshire. So it's nice to be with you all. It's sort of appropriate to be with you all for my first event for the book. Jonathan, since I saw you last, the organization I started back there at the West Side JCC in Los Angeles grew into an organization that is today known as Bend the Arc, and it's a sort of domestic Jewish social justice organization. But I left in 2008 to move to San Francisco to become the CEO of the San Francisco Bay Area Federation, which is the third largest federation in the country. And I was there for not even a year when I began to be recruited by the New Israel Fund, which has been sort of my first Israel love since I graduated from Brandeis University in 1990 with a degree in Near Eastern and Judaic Studies and History, and got involved in NIF's New Generations Project in Boston. And so after just about a year, just over a year at Federation, I moved over to NIF And while it certainly has been an often challenging job to run an organization that is sort of the largest support system for liberal civil society in Israel during these last 12 years, it has also been an incredible honor and a remarkable honor to be able to have that job. And then, of course, we get to now, when Israel has a new government, still new-ish, just as we have, and my job for the first time in 12 years becomes a little bit easier because, of course, the current Israeli government, which is not the one that I was writing about in the book, has not only leadership from the Israeli hard right that has been in power for the last 12 years, but also the moderate and liberal and Arab Israeli camps, making it a much more balanced government for someone like me in a job like mine. So that's what I've been doing for the last 20 years.
Terrific. Thank you so much. And yes, this is a remarkable time for this book to come out, and a remarkable time with the changing government for us to, kind of double down on a conversation about how we got to this place in Israel. So let's start. I'd like to start just at the opening of your book, jump right into some questions, start our deep dive, and start with a quote. Just at the beginning, you write the following: Israel, is there any other topic which so many intelligent, educated, and sophisticated people express such strongly and passionately held convictions, but about which they know so little? The problem is compounded because these people on all sides of the issue think they know what they're talking about. They sincerely believe what they think is true. So Daniel, my first question for us tonight is, recognizing how hard it is to change hearts and minds, you start off in your book just sharing that right off the bat. What were your motivations for Can We Talk About Israel? Why this book? Why now? And what do you hope this book will achieve?
Well, I guess the simplest answer, and this is a much easier conversation to have in one sense with all of you than it is with, I don't know, the Miami Book Festival or a non-Jewish communal audience. The simple answer is I think Israel matters profoundly. I think it is both one of the great, if not the great sort of Jewish miracle of our times. And I think it poses one of the great challenges that we have as a global Jewish community to figure out how we can participate in advancing that project. And having said that, I believe Israel is also one of the most, if not the most, divisive topics to roil the Jewish communal discourse in my adult lifetime. Wasn't always like that. But since I've been doing this work, it's gotten steadily and steadily worse. And for a very long time, there has been a growing disconnect between what American Jews feel and think about Israel and what our institutions and communal establishment leadership say about Israel. And there is sometimes a sense that to be pro-Israel means to be in favor of whatever it is that the Israeli government decides to do at the moment. And you have an increasingly liberal American Jewish community confronted with, up until at least last May, an increasingly hardline Israeli government. And that gap has caused in poll after poll. And I'm not only talking about Jewish pollsters, although that too, I'm talking about Pew and Gallup, a widening gap of a vector of drift and disaffiliation, especially among young American Jews when it comes to Israel. And I'm of the belief that unless we talk honestly about this, unless we have a serious conversation about Israel, warts and all, we're in danger of losing the support of that generation of American Jews, not support, the connection of a coming generation of American Jews to Israel. And I think that's a big problem. And beyond the Jewish community, I know that there are many, many people in this country and in the world who find themselves sort of standing on the sideline. They have some understanding that this is important. They have sympathy for the Jewish story, and they know what happened to us as a people in living memory, in the memory of some of us on the call right now. But they also can see every day the way Israel treats the Palestinians, and they see they see on their TV screens and they read in the papers the complex nature of the story coming out of Israel, and they're not sure what to make of it. And
Okay.
rather than have them check out, I want to give them a tool or a set of tools with which they can try to navigate and understand that difficult issue.
Terrific. Thank you for that introduction. And we will return to your chapter and a question on your chapter about the changing relationship between American Jewry and Israel in a little bit. But let's take one step back first. Give us a quick overview, if you would, about how your book is different, how your book is structured, and how it tries to advance the conversation in a way that perhaps other books have not. Because certainly many books have been written on this, but I do feel yours is unique.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. Then at least I've got one success story out there.
You do.
Look, I think that there are obviously a lot of books written about Israel, and they tend to fall into a couple of categories as I see them. There are either, I'm going to just be undiplomatic for a minute, right? There are highly partisan polemics. Sometimes they are honest about what they're doing. Alan Dershowitz wrote a book that I think he called The Case for Israel. That's just sort of like talking points of a particular perspective. You get those sympathetic to the Palestinians, Palestinian authors, Israeli authors, Jewish authors writing more disguised or camouflaged polemics. They are arguments in favor of one side or the other. Some are more moderate than others. Some are less moderate. But this category of books are really part of the argument. They are part of one of the two sides having the fight about who's right and who's wrong. So that's category number one. Broad category number two are books that are far more nuanced, balanced, thoughtful, in my opinion, intelligent, from authors of various perspectives, but they are not written for a general audience. They're written for academics by academics. They're written for Middle East specialists by Middle East specialists, or in some cases, they're novels, right, which are wonderful, but which are doing a different thing. And what was missing, in my opinion, I want to say from a representative of my generation, and I do think every generation should have a book that they can use to navigate, hopefully more than one. When I was a kid, I read Thomas Friedman's From Beirut to Jerusalem. I read David Grossman, the Israeli author, wrote The Yellow Wind. I read Amos Oz's In the Land of Israel. I wanted something like that, but not for Israelis and not by Israelis, but for us, right? And so I couldn't find that thing. So at the urging of my wife, who's an actual writer, a novelist, who finally said, you should write this book. So that's why, and the big the contribution I hope the book has is that it is both honest and balanced, even though I'm very clear about who I am and where I'm coming from, but also accessible, both in the style of the writing, in the conversational tone, and also in the maps and charts and illustrations, and even in the design of the book itself. I wanted it to feel like something that was not intimidating, that felt like something that people would want to actually cart around with them while they're reading the book.
Terrific. So let's pick up on that in a second. So the way that the book is divided into two parts, correct? And the first part tells sort of the history, and the second part is the analysis. And that might feel intimidating to a reader, but indeed I didn't find it intimidating at all. And what I also really enjoyed was that peppered throughout the book, there are illustrations. You shared a little bit about these illustrations and how they add to the book. Why don't you just give us a little bit about that for a second? Yeah,
well, first I'll just say the structure of the book is I'm really glad you didn't find it intimidating, Jonathan. You're a great test reader. Look, one of the things I say when I speak about Israel, and in the passage that you read, it's embedded in that passage, right? People tend to have extremely strong opinions, but they don't actually always know what they're talking about. They often know a narrative, they know a story, but they don't have familiarity with the larger story. So I feel like in order to participate in this conversation, in order to understand it, you have to actually sort of read the history. And then, as you said, part two was a deep dive into some of the most contentious issues. By the way, there is like an additional part, which I called the lexicon of the conflict, which is like a handy glossary. And one of my teenage daughters, one who is in college now, said, "Dad, why don't you just write the lexicon? It would have been a lot shorter." But that's there for for my teenage daughters. But and as I said, as you referenced, the other question was illustrations, and there, my brilliant wife said one way to make this book more accessible is to make it beautiful. And we have a friend who is an extraordinarily talented illustrator. And so as Jonathan's holding up the cover, and that's a great story. The illustrator, Christopher Noxon, had been to Israel before. He would later go back with me on one of my NIF trips where we did a number of interviews for the book, and he would just sit sketching. But that cover that you're holding up, this right here, those of you who are familiar with Jerusalem, that is an illustration of a neighborhood in East Jerusalem called Silwan. It's a densely populated Palestinian neighborhood south of the sort of just outside of the Dung Gate, which leads to the Western Wall. And in the middle of Silwan, Israel has built a major archaeological, well, there's a major archaeological dig, and Israel has built Israelis have built a huge sort of museum visitor center called Ir David, City of David. And for me, and I write about Ir David in the book because it's an interesting metaphor, I think, for one of the battlefronts in Jerusalem, in Israel and in Jerusalem, which is the way that both sides to the conflict tend to try to obviate the connection of the other side. Not everybody, but extreme forces. And as I was describing this to Christopher sitting in his studio in Ojai, California, he was sketching and sketching. I was describing Silwan. He had never been there. And he turned around his sketch pad and he said, "Does it look anything like this?" And I said, "It looks exactly like that." And so throughout the book are these illustrations of Christopher's, and also throughout the book are some anecdotes of mine mixed in with the history and the analysis of my experiences and of stories that I tell about, my personal connection to Israel.
Very nice, beautiful, beautiful. I really enjoyed the illustrations very much. Tell me, so at the end of your first let's divide the book for a second into those two large sections, and then there's the lexicon at the end. And at the end of the first section, which is the history section, understand the history before we start to analyze it. You in that last chapter of that first part, you talk about something which I think we've all lived over the last few years, certainly in America, which is, but it's been broader than in America, is what you call a democracy recession. And this part of the book resonated for me quite a bit. Can you share what you meant by a democracy recession and how that led to the events of, as you discussed, the events of May, and to the situation we find ourselves in today?
Sure. Well, democracy recession is a term coined by a political scientist, an American political scientist, and it refers to this sort of, I'm obviously, this is an editorial opinion on my part, which may not be agreed to with everyone watching and listening right now, but it describes a pretty horrific and increasingly commonplace moment in the life of liberal democracies worldwide. We saw, for example, he coined the phrase in referring to some of the, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, many of the Central European countries, emerged as these democracies. And Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Poland, sort of most notably among them, all of these countries, which really did sort of post-Soviet rule, founded themselves as new parliamentary democracies. All of them, to varying degrees, Hungary and Poland, the most extreme, have experienced a rollback of democratic freedoms, institutions, and values in favor of what I call a neo-autocratic majority rules democracy, right? So it's like a democracy without the Bill of Rights. The idea is whatever the ethnic or religious or whatever majority of the country wants, and whatever the leader of the country wants, and if those two things don't coincide, then and this is where it gets familiar to some of us in our country, it's the leader and his base, it's almost always a he, it's whatever they want. That is to say, there is less and less a sense of a polity that embraces a loyal opposition, and more a sense that there's only one right way. So Mr. Erdogan in Hungary is a prime example of this. Again, in Poland, in Brazil, and when I took this job, it was late 2009, and a few months later, New Israel Fund was attacked by an ultra right-wing organization, which turned out to have connections to the Prime Minister's office. We were defended, I was talking to our hosts before we started, by this remarkable band of, I call them Rockefeller Likudniks, right? Likudniks of conscience, the John McCains of Israel, including former president, then Speaker of the Knesset, Ruby Rivlin, son of former Prime Minister Menachem Begin, Benny Begin, and former Minister Dan Meridor. These became New Israel Fund's great champions in Israeli society. And they said, look, you may not like some of New Israel Fund's grantee organizations, but it's vital that Israel have a vibrant opposition, a vibrant civil society. That was not the view of the previous coalition governments up until last May in Israel. And so long before Donald Trump was anything to most Americans other than a reality talk show host or TV show host and real estate mogul, there was already in Israel a sense that democratic space was closing. There were laws that were proposed and some were passed that circumscribed freedom of expression, that stopped the way nonprofit organizations that the government didn't like could operate freely. And most disturbingly, there was a law that was passed called the nation state law a few years ago that for the first time upended Israel's delicate, purposeful balance of its Jewish identity on the one hand and its democratic identity on the other hand in favor of the Jewish identity, relegating Arabic to it stripped it of its official state language status. It made it a special language, specially protected language. But what was the purpose of this? To say that Israel is only the nation state of the Jewish people, right? As I say in the book, anyone who's visited Israel recently, and by recently I mean since 1948, has no doubt that Israel is a vibrant, thriving Jewish culture, Jewish cultures, we should say, right? The language is Hebrew, the papers are in Hebrew. Herzl's dream of Jewish thieves and prostitutes, as well as Jewish cops, it's realized. Again, in my opinion, sort of the great miracle. You see it in Tel Aviv. And yet you had a bunch of politicians saying, no, that is threatened by, and in that sense, it was an imaginary threat, right? One that was invoked only to be able to have a draconian response, which was red meat to a hardline base. And so this democracy recession, again, I understand you might not all agree with me. This democracy recession was something that suddenly in 2016 Americans needed to contend with. The idea that one of the two great political parties in this country, indeed, the one that was founded to end slavery, would be in sort of hypnotic sway to a leader who no longer connects his political motivations to reality or his political story to reality is something that was unthinkable to many of us a few years ago. Well, it's not unthinkable anymore. Many of us realize there's a real threat to American democracy, and so too in Israel. And the events of May. And by the way, Jonathan mentioned the events in May. There, I don't really mean at all the war between Hamas and the IDF, which is—
Thank you for clarifying. Correct.
Which is something that very sadly and upsettingly repeats, and we can talk about that, but that's a separate issue. What I meant was the horrific specter of Israeli on Israeli, Jewish Arab violence in the streets of Israel's mixed Jewish Arab cities, which is something that we haven't seen in any major way since the late 40s. And that specter, which stalked the country for a few weeks in May, ignited by the war in the most proximate way, but really the result of over a decade of Israel's 22% minority of Arab citizens. Remember, here in the States, the African-American community is 13% of our country. So it's 22% in Israel, this major minority, and we know and understand how powerful politically and socially and important and how much the grievances of the African American community are things that we need to consider with. I mean, that's been the lesson of the last years in our country, if not the entire history of our country. Well, in Israel, you've got a population that is almost twice as big, and they have also been on the receiving end of both great advantages. It's true, Arabs living in Israel have it better off than Arabs living in lots of other countries, but they've also been on the receiving end of systemic racism and discrimination. And that exploded in May. And the last thing I'll say is, if you had asked me in April, do you think Yair Lapid, the current foreign minister, previously the leader of the largest opposition centrist party, is he going to succeed in his crazy quest to cobble together a government of the right, center, and left and Arab parties to replace Netanyahu, based essentially on the idea that we've had Bibi for too long and he's driving us over a cliff? In February of 2021, I would have said no. In April, I would have said, you know what? It looks like he's going to do it. In May, thank God I wasn't foolish enough to say this to any media outlets. If you had asked me, I would have said, no, this tragic war and these terrible riots are going to empower the extremists on both sides, the extremists in the hard right in Israel and the extremists in the Hamas wing of the Palestinian movement. I was dead wrong. And in fact, what happened was, I believe, the events of May that I'm talking about, the intercommunal violence, were a red alert warning to Israeli politicians and Israelis from all across the political spectrum to say, we've got to stop this. We have got to avoid the cliff of this country falling apart. We've got to figure out a way to integrate our Arab population and honor it the way former President Rivlin used to always say Israel should have done, or we are going to have no future. So that's why I think the democracy recession was connected to the events of May. I apologize for the long answer.
No. Thank you. And I'm going to build off of it. Actually, I'm going to read a little bit more from chapter 16 of your book in a second. You then take us from that concept of this 22% of the Arab population, under 22%, but underrepresented and underappreciated within the community. And you actually make a claim which is very close to my heart, and I would like to read it now for everyone. When you write, what does it mean for a country that calls itself the Jewish state to have a non-Jewish minority that makes up a full fifth of its citizens? How can that country consider itself a democracy, guaranteeing equality for all of its citizens, even itself as a state that belongs to only one particular class of those citizens? These questions are at the heart of your identity dilemma, of the identity dilemma Israel has faced since its founding. They represent the balancing act Israel attempts as it tries to be all things at the same time. And and I want to focus on this line specifically when you write, and it is Israel's Arab citizens who bear the brunt and the burden of this aspect of the Israeli experiment. And you continue, and who perhaps provide the best hope for resolving it. So I'd ask you to please drill down on that a little bit for us. Why do you explain the claim that it is the Arab citizenry of Israel, the 22%, that perhaps provide the best hope for bringing Israel to a new place in its democracy?
Well, it's not fair of me to say that. I think it's honest, but it isn't fair.
Okay.
It's not fair to them. Look, we all know the many stories of I can't even pull it off. I was going to be very sarcastic to make a point, but I don't have the heart to do it. There are very few incidents in the history of Israel of disloyalty from its Arab citizenry. Now, up until 1966, from 48 to 66, right? So remember, in 48, somewhere in the neighborhood of 700,000 Arab residents of the land that is now Israel either flee or expelled or are expelled from their homes. The ones who remain are ruled by a military governor until 1966, right? In 1966, finally, they have the vote, mind you, but their right to move around the country the way they want, the way that they're tried in courts, are not like other Israelis. This is done, by the way, regionally rather than ethnically or racially, because even in those days, Israel understood that would be a problem to say Arabs can't do this and Jews can. So what they said was, in this part of the country, the triangle, which is the heavily Arab part of the center of the country, or in the north or in parts of the south, the military law remains from where it was during the War of Independence, which Arabs call the Nakba, the catastrophe. In 67, Israel wins the Six-Day War and takes all the land in the West Bank, Gaza, the Golan, East Jerusalem, and the Sinai. So some Israelis have said Israel was a total democracy for about 9 months between the moment in 66 when military rule of the Arab population ended and the moment in 67 when the Six-Day War was won. But But the reason why I say that the Arab citizens of Israel are both the burden bearers of Israel's unresolved identity question. Again, as I said earlier, what does it mean to be a democracy that gives full equality to all of its citizens, which is enshrined in paragraph 13 of Israel's founding Declaration of Independence on the one hand, and also it says a couple of lines earlier, which is that this is a haven for the Jewish people. This is the ingathering of the exiles, a Jewish homeland. That's the paradox that the founders bequeathed their, for future generations and all of us who care about Israel to wrestle with. I'm an optimist. My optimism sort of flows from my deep Jewish pessimism, but I'm an optimist, and I think that Israel and those of us who care about Israel can help with that, figure out that wrestling act. Look, our country was founded on a stark contradiction as well, right? We had a constitution that said all men are created equal, and then we enslaved, millions, and women didn't have the vote until the 1920s. So Israel's not the only country that faces this founding paradox. That said, I think it was Churchill who said that a country will be judged the way it deals with its widows and its orphans. He probably wasn't the first person to say it. In Israel's case, right? I think Israel will be judged by the way it deals with its Palestinian citizenry, and in showing a way forward where an Arab citizen of the state of Israel can be a proud Israeli who loves her country, but who is also proud of her Arab heritage and who says, I belong here and this is mine, but I also want to be part of this shared future together. I think that's where the hope for Israel lies. Now, former President Rivlin, who you all can tell I'm a big fan of, he said when he took office, he offered an official apology to the Arab Israeli community. He went to a place where there had been a massacre of unarmed Arab Israeli protesters, and he begged for forgiveness. And I was deeply moved by this. And I was just as moved by the willingness of that Arab community to say, we forgive you. We just want to be part of the future of this country. Up until the last election, the third largest party in the state of Israel was known as the Joint List. And it was a majority Arab party made up of a coalition of Arab parties, one of which was sort of a former communist liberal Arab Jewish party called Hadash, meaning new in Hebrew. And the leader of Hadash was a guy called Ayman Odeh, who's the one who pulled together the Joint List. He in the face of Netanyahu and former Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman, now the Treasury Minister, the Finance Minister, trying to raise the threshold that it took to get elected to the Knesset in order to block out Arab parties from ever even reaching the threshold, they came together, formed a joint list, and became the third largest party. And Lieberman's party crashed and almost exited the Knesset, which I thought was a Purim-like irony. In any event, Ayman Odeh said, gave the speech. He actually gave it at a Haaretz New Israel Fund conference, where he said, I don't want to be a leader of the Arab Israeli community. I want to be a leader of the Israeli community that believes that there's no future other than a shared future for our country. And that's why I think that part of the key to Israel's success as a true democracy, as it's set out to be, that can also be the homeland of the Jewish people, is in one of the great poignant ironies. One of the great hopes are people like Ayman Odeh, just as I would say, as unfair as it is, that Martin Luther King was represented, he was assassinated a few weeks before I was born, but represented and still represents to hundreds of millions of Americans the hope of what our country could be. And it's not fair that you should put that on a representative of a persecuted minority, but that's the beautiful thing about democracy. So that's why, again, another long answer, but that one required.
Thank you so much. I want to shift gears a little bit, bring us back to chapters 20 and 21 of your book. Chapters 20 and 21 of your book unpack two A words. One word is apartheid, and the other word is anti-Semitism. And of course, we know that Israel, is sometimes tagged with the word apartheid, and you address that in chapter 20. And then, of course, in America, unfortunately, today, particularly in the rise of the democracy recession, we've also seen a rise in anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Can you give us a little bit insight into how you think we as a Jewish community need to understand how these two words are being used and understand how we can respond when they are either used against us or used against Israel?
Okay, so I'm just going to indicate to our community today. Now we've entered the potentially controversial part of our evening. But
now we've entered
right now. Look, I'm a great believer that we can all talk about this subject civilly with each other, and you all know where I'm coming from. I love this place. I worry endlessly about it, and that's why I do the work that I do and wrote the book that I wrote. I feel the same way as an American. Look, for a long time, people bandied about the term apartheid in order to sort of tar or describe Israel, depending on where you come from. Now, there has been a recent development that complicates things a lot more, which was I was able to actually put into the book, even though there were several times the book was ready to go to print and I would call the publisher and say, but you got to let me have 2 more weeks. Just let's see how this turns out. And they sort of got into this rhythm of being excited. There was a final deadline where it had to go to the printing press, but luckily a few of these things made it into the book because they were late breaking developments. When it comes to apartheid, people often accuse Israel of being an apartheid state. Now, what they have generally meant by that is that they are comparing it to the South African apartheid regime. That's until recently, and that's one of the late breaking developments, which I'll come to briefly in a moment. That's what they mean. And so people always ask me, do you think Israel is an apartheid state? And what I say is, look, the short answer is no, Israel is not an apartheid state, but the longer answer is more complicated. And basically that chapter in the book, Jonathan, is taken from a trope that a speech that I've given 1,000,000 times, right? Where to do it al regel echat, on one foot, I say, if you give me an intellectually honest group of hard left-wing critics of Israel, but they have to be honest, right? They have to be willing to have their minds change. And you let me take them up and down the length and breadth of the state of Israel for a couple of weeks. And we meet Arabs and Jews, Mizrahim, Ashkenazim, Ethiopians, and Russians. If they meet social justice activists and community leaders, doctors and nurses, if they see both the restrictive laws like the nation state law and the Nakba law that fines Arab municipalities for referring to the events of 1948 as the catastrophe, they would find many examples of systemized racism and discrimination. But if they see on the Supreme Court, the High Court of Justice, that for decades there has been an Arab sitting justice, one who, by the way, made the determination that former Israeli President Moshe Katsav, accused and convicted of rape, had to go to jail, right? If they would see that an Arab citizen of Israel was in the position to have to make that decision, if they would see that just until that last election, the third largest party in Israel was an Arab party with all the rights and privileges of any other party, right? If they would see that during COVID, right, which hit Israel very hard, Arab Israeli citizens are way misrepresented in the medical professions. That is to say, they are overrepresented. So if you are sick, if your life is in danger in Israel, you often will you will see an Arab doctor or nurse or pharmacist. The first responders to the tragedy on Mount Meron, time moves so quickly we've forgotten, but right, like an ultra-Orthodox pilgrimage site in the north of Israel, a ramp collapsed. It was horrific. Many died. Many were injured. The first responders were Arab Israeli EMTs and doctors, right? If you saw all that, you would be hard pressed to tell me, if you were being honest, that what you saw looked in any way like apartheid under South Africa. Now, if you give me a group of intellectually honest, right-wing Christian Zionists, AIPAC supporters, but open-minded and intellectually honest, and you let me take them up and down the length and breadth of the West Bank, and we meet with Palestinian villagers and settlers and soldiers, and we look at the checkpoints, not just between the West Bank and Israel proper, but also between different towns, Palestinian cities in the West Bank. If we saw the way the West Bank looks like Swiss cheese, with Palestinian enclaves surrounded by totally Israeli-controlled territory, if we saw the inequitable distribution of land, of electricity, of resource. If we look at the fact that in violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, Israel has moved 700,000 of its own citizens into occupied territory. If we looked at the two systems of justice, right? One, Israeli civilians living in territory that not even Israel describes as Israel officially, the West Bank settlements, who get to vote in Israeli elections, who get to drive on roads into Israel and tunnels that Palestinians can't access, who are tried in Israeli civil courts, while Palestinians are stuck in the villages, tried by military courts, right? You'd be hard pressed to say that what you saw in those 2 weeks didn't resemble apartheid in South Africa as it was practiced in South Africa. So that took me 5 minutes, and this was a crowd that knows the basics already. So it's not a soundbite. But and I go through that all in the book, and I end the chapter by quoting my former board chair, Israel's former state prosecutor, a woman called Talia Sasson, a dear friend who advised Ariel Sharon's government. And she said in an interview when she was asked, would you call it apartheid? She said, it's bad enough what it is without referring to an inaccurate historical analogy. And that's kind of where I come down. It's bad enough what it is. But the caveat is, in recent months, two major Israeli human rights organizations and Human Rights Watch, the largest international human rights organization in the world, have come out with legal opinions two of them have come out with legal opinions that say in the West Bank, Israel is committing the international war crime of apartheid. They say, we're not saying it's an apartheid regime or an apartheid state. We're just talking about, it may be unfortunate that this crime was named apartheid because it stirs up emotion, but the crime has three elements, as is often the case in criminal law, international or domestic. One, that one group of citizens is privileged, one group of humans are privileged over another group based on an immutable characteristic like race, ethnicity, gender, etc. Two, that systems are built to perpetuate and propagate that differentiation. And three, that, quote, inhumane acts, unquote, defined by two treaties as things like punitive home demolitions of families of suspected terrorists, or restrictions on freedom of movement and freedom of expression, or unequal court access and different systems of justice. With that definition, Israel is, says Human Rights Watch and Yesh Din, a very serious Israeli human rights organization, committing the crime of apartheid in the West Bank. So again, this is a very difficult, very challenging thing to talk about. Occupations like Israel's occupation of the West Bank are not in and of themselves illegal under international law, under the Geneva Conventions, to which Israel is a signatory. But moving your civilian population into territory that you've conquered is a violation of international law. So that's the first A word. The second A word is in a way simpler, but in a way more complex, which is, this challenging thing of how do we know, like, when does criticism of Israel equal anti-Semitism? Now, there are many who would say any criticism of Israel at all is anti-Semitic. And I think those people are wrong. Right. And then there are those who say there's nothing you can say when you're criticizing a country that should be construed as anti-Semitic. And I think those people are also wrong. So in the book, I sort of give some handy guide points that were formulated by my friend Rabbi Jill Jacobs, who wrote a piece in the Washington Post in which she said, look, here are some ways of determining whether a criticism of Israel feels anti-Semitic or whether some utterance or writing around Israel should be construed as anti-Semitic or an action. And she says things that I think are probably pretty obvious to many of us on this call, right? If you blame Jews in Los Angeles or London or Paris, if you blame them and attack them and denigrate them because of what Israel has done or what you think Israel has done, that's anti-Semitic. That's anti-Semitism. That's like bright line anti-Semitism right there. Right? It becomes a little blurrier, but it's still highly problematic when people exhibit a level of opprobrium when it comes to Israel that they don't exhibit with any other country in the world. That's why Israelis are skeptical of the United Nations, right? Which trains its rhetorical General Assembly firepower on Israel while ignoring what dozens of war state actors do. And it's hard for some of us to believe that, some of that has to do with just really not liking the idea of a place where Jews can have their own country, which may not be hatred of Jews per se in and of itself, but that reeks of anti-Semitism. If the
Comes
only
close.
people in the
Comes
world,
close.
right, if we're the only people who don't get it right of self-determination, that's problematic.
Right.
But you know what? And this is where, again, I know this may really upset people. I was asked in an interview earlier about Irish author Sally Rooney, who is a hugely popular millennial author, and who just announced yesterday that she wouldn't allow her third book, unlike her previous two books, to be translated into Hebrew and released by an Israeli publishing company, unless there was an Israeli publishing company that disavowed Israeli policy, et cetera, et cetera. And she was immediately accused of anti-Semitism. And I don't think that what she did was anti-Semitic. Now, I don't agree with it. I'm opposed to cultural and educational and academic boycotts in virtually, well, I shouldn't say virtually every circumstance, because I don't know what circumstances will arise in the world. But certainly in the case of Israel and many other countries, I don't think the problem is solved by taking away the exchange of ideas between people, artists, academics, scholars, who tend to be the most thoughtful people trying to resolve these conflicts. So I'm opposed to it. But me being opposed to the BDS movement, which I am, which New Israel Fund is different than me saying the BDS movement is anti-Semitic, right? Sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. So the problem is we have to have the patience to really look through on a case-by-case basis what constitutes anti-Semitism and what doesn't. When Michael Oren, the former minister and Israeli ambassador to the U.S., and a guy from Philly originally, and I know him a bit, but and he's a nice guy. But when a few years ago the European Union announced that it would enact a law that it had passed years ago called meaningful differentiation, which would require that goods made in Israeli settlements not be labeled as made in Israel in EU supermarkets. Let's just take that for a second. The EU wasn't saying settlement goods are not welcome in EU supermarkets. It wasn't saying that we won't sell Israeli goods. It wasn't saying anything like that. It just said, you can't send us cans of tomatoes that say made in Israel if they were made in a settlement. They have to say made in an Israeli settlement in the West Bank. Michael Oren said that's anti-Semitism. It's the same as the Nazi boycott of the Jews in the 30s. That kind of, in my opinion, totally disingenuous weaponization of the term anti-Semitism to attack critics of Israel, even in this case, Israel's biggest trading partner, which is the EU. It's not the US, it's the EU, is scurrilous in my opinion. So you have the problem of people who really just don't like Jews cloaking their criticism of Jews as criticism of Israeli policy, and some in Israeli leadership and in the Jewish community ascribing to any reasonable critique of Israel or Israeli policy anti-Semitism.
Great, thank you. I want to add, I've lived in Israel several times in my life as a student, as a family, with a family, lived in Modi'in, Jerusalem. But you bring up in these two chapters, or particular chapter on apartheid, really resonated with me, because I do believe that many American Jews, as you talk about, are both deeply in love with Israel as you are, and deeply uncomfortable with some of the things they see happening in Israel as you are, as I am, and as many of us are. And being able to, when you write that and I can read that, it helps to support my own feeling that that's legitimate, that can be a legitimate place. So I thank you for that.
Well, I'm really glad to hear that, because it always, I know this sounds incredibly naive and I keep making the same analogy, but since when do any of us think that being profoundly, deeply opposed to the policies of the Trump administration, or if you're a Republican, a Trump person, the Biden administration, like none of us think that means that you're not a patriotic American, that you don't care about your country, that you're anti-American. And somehow that is lost in the discourse about Israel too often.
Right. Absolutely. And so thank you again. I want to leave some time for questions. So I just want to kind of close. If you can, at the conclusion of your book, Daniel, you introduce us to three people in a chapter called the case for hope. You introduced us to Maizan. I hope I pronounced that. Maisam. I hope I pronounced that correctly.
Pretty good.
Mutasim and Gadi.
Yeah.
3 activists fighting for a more democratic Israel. As a lifelong lover of Israel, what hopes and dreams, short and long term, do you have for Israel's future? How did you see your dreams in their dreams? And we'll close with that. And then I'll just say before we close that we will take questions from the group. I would ask you to please put your questions into the chat. You can start putting your questions in now. The questions will come to me. And then as soon as Daniel closes on this question, I'll start offering questions to Daniel from the audience. Okay?
Great.
Sure.
Well, look, I lived in it like you. I lived in Israel, and I lived there for 2 years during the sort of halcyon golden era of the Rabin administration for someone like me. And what I felt and witnessed and saw living in Israel and working in Israel at that time was an Israel that was reaching its hand out to the Palestinians, to the Arab world, to the broader world, and the hand was being reached out towards Israel in return. And it was a heady time. And it imprinted upon me this sort of sense of what could be. And I still believe that sense of what could be is out there. I write in the book that the problem with resolving this conflict has never been a lack of political imagination, right? It's a lack of political will. Right. It's like Occam's razor. The most likely scenario is usually the right one. The reason why we don't have peace is because too many people who have had either power or access to power have not wanted to resolve the conflict. And when people talk about the failure of the Oslo Accords, I take umbrage at that. It was the murder of the Oslo Accords in the murder of Prime Minister Rabin by a Jewish terrorist, and then the murder of scores of Israelis by Hamas and Islamic Jihad, fundamentalist Islamic terrorists, right, that caused everything to collapse. So as Rabin himself noted, it's a lot easier to break a peace process down than it is to start it up. And the tragedy of our time is now we're decades after that awful assassination and those terrible murders, and we're further away, it seems, than we've ever been before, until you talk to actual people on the ground. And when I said that the great honor of my career has been running the New Israel Fund, what I meant was, I haven't been there in almost, it'll be 2 years February, which is horrible because of the pandemic, obviously. But I'll usually I'm there 5 times a year, and when I'm there, I'm shoulder to shoulder with people like Maisam, Mutasim, and Gadi, who are, regardless of what the commentators and pundits are telling us, and ignoring those who say it's all lost, they are rolling up their sleeves and working to build a better Israel every day. And Maisam Jaljuli, the first of the 3 people to whom I hand the proverbial microphone, Maisam is a feminist, an activist, a shared society activist her defining moment was when Meir Kahane, remember him, the racist Brooklyn-born, moved to Israel rabbi who was banned by Yitzhak Shamir's government from serving in the Knesset because he was an inciter towards racism. When he tried to go to her Arab village, the neighbors from Jewish towns and kibbutzim nearby drove to the village and stood with the Arab villagers side by side and formed a human chain, preventing Kahane's supporters from entering the city. And that to her was this moment of saying, this is who we can be as a country. And her whole life has been dedicated to trying to realize that. Again, why I say maybe unfairly, a lot of the burden lies on Arab citizens of Israel. Mutasim is neither Palestinian nor Jewish. He's not even Israeli. He is the first recognized sub-Saharan Sudanese political asylum seeker who received refugee status. After walking across the deserts to escape the horror in Darfur, he's not seen his family since he left decades ago. He became the first asylum seeker to finish law school in Israel. He became the first one to receive status in Israel. And now he devotes himself to helping other immigrants and asylum seekers in Israel. And why, he says, why did he go to Israel? He said, this is a true story. He said, well, we always knew that the Jews had been persecuted so terribly. And the only people who reached out to us in Darfur were American Jewish synagogues and the American Jewish World Service. And we knew that the Jews were people who cared about people who were suffering from genocide. So we thought the place where we have to go is Israel.
Wow.
And one of my proudest moments as CEO of NIF is one of our grantee organizations that NIF actually founded a few years ago, called Zazim, which means we are moving. It's like a moveon.org type outfit. When Prime Minister Netanyahu was threatening to forcibly deport 40,000 sub-Saharan African refugee and asylum seekers like Mutassim, Zazim ran a community campaign. Hundreds of thousands of regular Israelis signed a petition to Israel's flight attendant and pilot unions, and urging them to refuse to fly asylum seekers whose safety couldn't be guaranteed back to their home countries. And the Israeli pilots and flight attendants unions proudly said, we won't do it. If you're going to do it, you're going to have to use army planes because we will not fly them. This, for me, right, is the case for hope. So, and that's not even an Israeli, right? And then the third guy, Gadi Gavaryahu, is probably about 70. He is an Orthodox Jew, and he founded an organization called Tag Ma'ir, which means in Hebrew light tag. And the reason it's called light tag, which seems nonsensical, is because it was formed in response to Tag Machir, which means price tag, which is a Jewish settler terror organization that attacks Palestinians and their property and their villages whenever they feel that any settlement has any advance of the settlement enterprise, ironically, has been checked by the Israeli government or army. They take it out on Palestinians. And Gadi Gavaryahu founded a group that at first was Israelis who would go to the site of a murder or an arson attack or some other awful event, and they would stand in solidarity with the victims, saying, "This is not in our name. We are religious Israeli Jews, and we don't agree." And I don't know if you remember, a few years ago there was a horrific terror attack on a synagogue in Har Nof in Jerusalem, and a number of worshipers were murdered at prayer while they were davening. And then Tag Ma'ir expanded to have religious Muslims from the West Bank who joined, and they would they went to Har Nof and stood in solidarity with the Jews there, saying, not in our name. So the reason I ended the book with these three, well, I guess it's apparent right now. That's the New Israel Fund universe. They're all NIF grantees, and they're the people who have and continue to renew the faith that I feel lucky enough to have gotten in Israel when I lived there in 94 and 95.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for ending us with a little uplift and a little pride about how our country can be, how Israel, our Jewish country, can be all that it hopes to be. I want to start with a question. First question, we'll take about, if the timing works, Connie, Nancy, 10 minutes for questions. Is that okay? Okay, does that work? Okay. One of the things you mentioned is that in order for the peace process to move forward, in order for relationships to improve between these groups, each group needs to, both the Arab Israeli population and the Jewish Israeli population, need to acknowledge a profound connection to the land of Israel. How do you see that being encouraged? How do you see that happening?
Well, I think my pal Ruby Rivlin really provides a terrific example of how this could happen. As I said, when he became president, one of the first official acts he did was to ask for forgiveness on behalf of the Israeli people for treating Israel's Arab citizenry the way that it did for so long in the state. And Rivlin once said to me, when he was Speaker of Knesset before he was president, I had asked him, I said, you are a mystery to me, right? You want to annex the West Bank, which is anathema to someone like me, and yet you say Israel should annex the West Bank and immediately extend full citizenship and equal rights to everyone in it, Palestinian and settler alike, which is anathema to Bibi and to Naftali Bennett. And I said, how do you imagine that country, that if you did that, you would not ultimately be voted into Palestine? And he said, well, you and I believe different demographic realities, which I thought was a questionable thing to pin your hope on. But he thought that the numbers weren't the normally accepted numbers about Jewish and Arab birth rates. But beyond that, he said, look, and this was deeply moving to me. He said, if we treated the Palestinians in the West Bank the way we should have treated our own Arab citizens from the very beginning, why in the world would they want to be part of any country in this region other than Israel? We need to say to them, you are us and we are you, and you are our brothers and sisters, and we are your brothers and sisters. Now, like, that's not a nobody, nor is it some guy like me, some idealist sitting in San Francisco. This is the former president of Israel, Likud hardline politician Ruby Rivlin. And I believe that Rivlin's example is the answer to the question that you ask. By instead of trying to do the thing that too many Palestinians and too many Israelis, too many Arabs and too many Jews try to do, which is to erase the history of the other. You know, Yasser Arafat used to say that there was no evidence that the temple existed in the old city on the Temple Mount where the Dome of the Rock is. That is an ahistorical statement, right? Like, that is simply not true. You know, and similarly, there are people who claim, not fringe figures, that there's, I'm not talking about Golda Meir in 1975, I'm talking about today. There are people who would say there's no such thing as the Palestinian people. They are recent transplants from 100 years ago who wandered in from Saudi Arabia. That is an ahistorical point. Like, both of these things are baseless, completely untrue. And yet, there is so much energy invested into propagating this winner-take-all claim to the land. You know, the example, one of the examples I give in the book, when I lived in Israel, there was this crazy blight of people erasing the Arabic from trilingual and bilingual street signs. They would put ultra-nationalist right-wing bumper stickers, or they'd spray paint it with black spray paint. Still happens. As if like erasing Arabic is going to erase 22% of the population. As if telling Palestinians that you are not a real people and you never were here is going to stop the way they feel. As if telling Jews that you didn't have a temple and that there's no Jewish stone in Jerusalem, no stone that is Jewish stone in Jerusalem, as one of the muftis of Jerusalem said recently, as if that's going to make Jews feel differently. And what I always say to people is, let's say, for the sake of argument, that there was no Jewish temple where the Dome of the Rock stands. And let's say, for the sake of argument, that there's no such thing as Palestinians. They drifted in from the Saudi desert 100 years ago. Do you think, realistically, that that's going to change for a second the way either of us feel about that place? Right? I mean, of course not. It's ridiculous. And so rather than try to deny and ignore and one up the other side, take the example of Rivlin, honor the connection, and then move on from there.
Terrific, terrific. I just want to give anyone else in our audience, in our audience, an opportunity to put their question in the chat. I know it takes a little longer to fit than it does to say it, so I just want to give another minute. Okay. And I will, while we're waiting for a last question, I will ask my final question, which is, who should read this book? Who should write? You wrote it. Why is it so hard to talk about Israel? Right? You've made it easier through your book. Right? I'm a Jewish professional. I assume most of us here are lovers of Israel. Who should read this book, and what audiences do you feel should read this book that maybe wouldn't take it off the shelf? And if we could send them a free copy, we should do that as soon as possible.
Well, Jonathan, your last question was the very first question I asked myself when I sat down to start writing this book, which is, who am I writing for? And that was, until I figured that one out, it was difficult because while the book is comfortably aimed at Jews and the Jewish community in the US, Canada, Britain, Australia, who are thoughtful and who haven't quite subscribed to either of the two hard lines about Israel, I wanted it to be more than that. I wanted it to be open. I wanted it to be inviting also to non-Jews who knew this was a subject that that was important, that they were curious about, that they had strong feelings about, but they were afraid of tripping the emotional minefields that Israel brings up for people. And the answer that I found was a funny one. I'll tell you very quickly. I'm part of a network called Reboot, and those of you who are Jewish professionals may have heard of it. It's been around for about 20 years. I was in the first class, and the whole idea of Reboot was two program officers for Bronfman and Spielberg's foundations decided, let's figure out a way to get 20 and 30 and 40-something-year-old young Jews, by the way, we're all older now, who are leaders or are going to be leaders in arts, culture, journalism, and social justice and politics. And let's bring them together, people who are sort of maybe questioning, but curious, and we'll put them together and create a network. And they sprinkled it with people like me who could relate to those people, but who were much more secure in how we felt about things. And I was sort of the Israel guy that they brought in. And in my years of having conversations with these people, I could see that they were super smart, super skeptical, but they were open to an honest exploration. And so when I sat down to write the book, I thought, I'm writing this for rebooters, Jewish and non-Jewish, of all ages, all around the world. The curious, the skeptical, the open-hearted, the compassionate, those who have not turned off because they're disgusted, they haven't walked away, they haven't, even if they feel very strongly, they're open to the possibility that they might not know everything and have all the answers. Or there are people like you, Jonathan, who do know an awful lot, but who maybe need some reinforcement. That, in my opinion, your very common sense, love for Israel and commitment to liberal values are not antithetical. People like that need reinforcement, since it's really for those groups, those audiences, I wrote the book.
Thank you. Thank you. We have one final question. I'm going to, I think it's worth asking.
Sure.
I don't know if you'll, I don't know if you'll tell me how you want to say this. The question is, can you comment on the book Apiragon? And for those of you who are unfamiliar, Apiragon is a book about two fathers who have a connection through shared tragedy, Israeli and Israeli Arab. And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, so I can comment on it. I really appreciate the question. I'm very curious who asked it. The book is by Colm McCann, who is one of my very favorite authors, I will say. And I have to make two important disclosures. Full disclosure, number one, the fathers that he writes about are real people, although he sort of has novelized, fictionalized versions of them. And they're part of an organization called the Bereaved Parent Circle. And that organization is a grantee of the New Israel Fund. So I'm not particularly impartial or objective about this. This is an organization of Jews and Palestinians, Israelis and Palestinians, Jews and Arabs, who have lost loved ones, often their children, to the violence of the conflict, and who come together, kind of like my friends at Tag Ma'ir, who I described earlier, to sort of say, no, there has to be another way. You know, folks, there are people out there who hate this organization. I just want you to think about that for a minute, and who you would have to be to hate an organization of Jewish and Arab parents who find solace in trying to talk to each other and other people about their losses as a reason to end the conflict. The second disclosure I have to make is that my favorite blurb on the back of this book is by Colm McCann. So he wasn't an impartial reader of my book. So look, I think it's a really beautiful, powerful, difficult, and important read. And I highly recommend it. I don't know what else to say beyond that. I suppose I've walked right into the heart of the controversy surrounding the book. The other thing I'll say, which is probably nothing I'll ever get to say on one of these book talks for the next year and a half when I'm doing them, folks, you should go out and read his National Book Award winner, Let the Great World Spin, which is sort of about New York and 9/11. And he's an Irish author. And then you should read his book, Transatlantic. This guy I think he's one of the great novelists of my generation. But I think Apiragon is a very important book, which, by the way, won the Jewish Book Award last year.
Wow. So we came to talk about your book, and now we have 5 books we all have to buy, including yours.
We are Jews here.
We are Jews here. We are Jews here. We are the people of the books. Fass, thank you, Daniel. Thank you so much for spending your afternoon, our evening together. I'm gonna ask Connie to come back and close us off with tonight's event. Connie, I'm adding you to the spotlight. I'm removing myself. And before I sign off, I just want to say, Daniel, it was a pleasure. And I look forward to reading your next book. Thank
you, Jonathan. Thanks, everybody.
When it comes. Okay.